Okay, hey everybody, here is the lecture on JFK's foreign policy, 1961 to 1963. Cold Warrior. I'm going to give some background first on stuff Kennedy faced when he came into office, and then we will talk about Bay of Pigs, which occurred very early when he had only a few months into his presidency. The next year, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Following that, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the Hotline. Then the Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps, which he started his presidency with, but I'm going to do them a fifth. Then the Berlin Wall and the Berlin Wall speech. Throughout all of this, Vietnam was kind of percolating in the background, but I will talk about it in a class tomorrow. Here's some background. 1960 election, it was, of course, Kennedy versus Nixon, and the Cold War was a big topic. The U-2 spy plane had just been shot down, and the arms race was continuing between the Soviet Union and the United States. And one of the issues became fears that there was a missile gap between the two countries, that somehow the U.S. had fallen behind the USSR. And that kind of was a potential issue in helping Kennedy win. There was no such gap. The U.S. always had many more missiles and far more power in their nuclear warheads than the Soviets did, but we were nevertheless always afraid that they were catching up to us or passing us. And of course, in 1957, something had happened that had made us worry that we were behind, so this just filled that in. Of course, you can put in your notes what that thing is from 57. Who has more missiles, US or USSR? One other background item. 1954 in Guatemala, 1961, Cuba Bay of Pigs. So you can see, here is, let's go with red, here is Guatemala, and here, of course, is Cuba. To understand what happened in the Bay of Pigs invasion, it is helpful to look back 7 years to Guatemala. So what's going on in Guatemala in 1954? Well, bananas are what's going on. The United Fruit Company, which was the name of the company that grew and sold Chiquita bananas, still, now it has a different name, different company, but it's still the Chiquita Banana Company, was basically running Guatemala. They were the largest landowner and biggest employer in Guatemala for many years. Guatemala is an independent country, but only sort of. UFC was widely criticized for exploiting its labor force, treating Guatemala and other countries where it grew bananas like its own colony. In fact, it is in the early 1900s that you get the term Banana Republic, which is now the name of a clothing chain, but originally meant a South American or Central American country that most of its economy is built around bananas, and the banana companies basically own all the land, and the rich landowners run the country. And so it's seen as a country that doesn't have a real government. It's a puppet government that does what the big corporations want. Guatemala in the 1930s and 40s was definitely a banana republic. In 1944, there was a revolution that overthrew the dictator, Ubico, and they held democratic elections. And for a number of years, there was a democracy. Once these democratic presidents were elected, they clashed with the United Fruit Company. They wanted to take land away from them and redistribute it to the poor peasants that were being exploited by the banana plantation. The U.S. and Eisenhower get involved because we're concerned about communist influence. But there's more to it than that. This turns out that there were incredibly close connections between the CIA and UFC. What's the CIA? You probably know. It is not part of the military. It's a civilian agency. It's our spy agency, Central Intelligence Agency, so you should know that. And it was formed in the late 40s after World War II as part of the Cold War to gather intelligence overseas, espionage, and to do kind of covert actions that the military wasn't going to take on. What were the connections between CIA and the UFC? Well, President Eisenhower's Secretary of State, you might remember, was John Foster Dulles. His brother, Alan, was the head of the CIA. Alan actually sat on the board of directors of United Fruit, and the law company that John Foster Dulles sometimes worked for, Sullivan and Cromwell, actually represented UFC in their actions, was their attorney. So it's definitely a conflict of interest. That type of close connection between a government leader and a company wouldn't be allowed today. Anyway, what happened, that's a picture of Eisenhower on the left and John Foster Dulles on the right. In 1954, Eisenhower authorized the CIA to organize a coup against the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Arbenz. The CIA armed, trained, and organized the Guatemalan forces. The forces invaded Guatemala and overthrew Arbenz. Military dictatorship was established, UFC was happy, and for the next 30 years, Guatemala was run by dictators who were US-backed. So no democracy, but also no communism. From Eisenhower's point of view, and the American government, at that time, it's a win. The significance is this, I've talked, I guess, slow down here on your notes and pay good attention. I've talked a lot about some of the amazingly good things that the American government did after World War II, Marshall Plan, setting up democracies in Japan and stabilizing Europe. We also did some dirty things, and Guatemala is a very good example. It's not the only one of our dirty actions around the world, in the Third World, in the Cold War, especially in Latin America. So Guatemala is a very good example to keep in mind of that. It's also an example of what the CIA could accomplish, and that's going to be our lesson for Cuba. Fast forward to the end of the decade, new decade. That is a picture of Fidel Castro on the right and Che Guevara on the left. Cuba, like Guatemala, was, after the Spanish-American War, a land of few rich landowners who held power and many poor peasants. After a series of dictators who were, again, friendly to the United States in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, in the 50s, there's a long Cuban revolution against the dictator Batista. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolutionaries win the Cuban Revolution and depose the Cuban dictator Batista. Now, Castro is definitely a revolutionary. He definitely moves Cuba far to the left. But initially, it wasn't clear that he was going to go all the way over to the Soviet side. But we were worried about that, and there were problems right away where he took away, there were 2 American oil companies there, and he took them over, just nationalized them. So Eisenhower follows a similar plan to the Guatemalan plan. He approves a $13 million plan to arm, train, and organize anti-Castro rebels. It never actually takes place before he leaves office, and I'm not clear if he just didn't get to it or if he decided to not pull the trigger. Kennedy takes office and approves the plan. So that's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. You know where Guantanamo is, there's Havana, and they land about 1,400 rebels, Cuban rebels, who had been trained in Florida by the CIA, and they want to attack Castro's army, and what Kennedy has been told by the CIA is that Castro is not that popular, and a popular uprising will spark throughout the countryside, and Castro will be taken from power. Sorry, that's a little hard to read. The CIA tries to keep the U.S. assistance a secret, so Kennedy decides not to provide direct air support, although there is some air support in planes that are painted to look like they are Cuban planes. 1,400 anti-Castro soldiers. The invasion force lands and very quickly is defeated. The peasants of the countryside don't rally to the anti-Castro rebels. Castro, it turns out, is more popular than the CIA thought. And the whole thing's a disaster because not only does it fail, but the fact that we were behind it becomes widely known. That's a huge failure. Huge foreign policy failure for Kennedy. It worsens relations with Cuba and the USSR. It's a black eye. It makes us look bad around Latin America and around the world. So that's how Kennedy kind of starts his presidency. And it's going to indirectly, or pretty directly, lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So our next thing, 10 minutes in. The next year is the Cuban Missile Crisis that you're all at least a little bit familiar with. The USSR builds missile sites in Cuba to protect Cuba from the United States and puts missiles, actually with nuclear warheads, on ships to Cuba. U.S. spy planes flying over Cuba notice the missile sites and they figure out what they are when the photographs are analyzed. And Kennedy orders a blockade to prevent nuclear warheads from reaching Cuba, a naval blockade. And there's a showdown. How are we going to resolve this without war? And it is public. You can see from the headlines in the background that everybody knows what's going on, and so it's kind of 10 days in October that are very tense. And the world worries that we're going to have World War III and possibly a nuclear war. I don't know if you remember General LeMay. He was, search back in your notes, see if you can figure out where he's from. He played a prominent part in a previous war. Typical of LeMay, if you remember him, he recommends a massive first strike bombing attack. He wants to turn Cuba into a sheet of glass. He's afraid that once those nuclear missiles are there, we'll be at Cuba's, vulnerable to a nuclear attack, and it could happen too quickly for us to respond. In case you didn't figure it out, LeMay is the one who did the firebombing of Tokyo and bombed those 67 major Japanese cities. He is ready to take them out. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's the head of the military, who advises the Secretary of Defense and the President, prepares for an attack, an air attack, and an invasion. That is their recommendation out of all their options. That's the fear, that missiles in Cuba will reach all the major cities of the United States and even Mexico. So it's a very public standoff. It's very tense. Eventually, Kennedy and Khrushchev, the Russian leader, reach a resolution. The Soviets will remove the warheads and missiles. The U.S. has to publicly promise not to invade Cuba, even though, we had already tried. And secretly, we didn't tell anybody this, but we agreed that we would remove missiles from Turkey, which were similarly close to the Soviet Union, just like Cuba was threatening to the United States. So we decided to kind of respect each other's backyard and remove some of the threat. This, unlike the Bay of Pigs, shows JFK at his diplomatic best. Impressive maneuvering and understanding of the Soviet side that they were kind of in a pickle. They needed a way to get out of this that was public. There's Mr. Pally. I'm recording a lecture. What's the aftermath? Well, what we did not know at the time is that some nuclear missiles had already arrived on the island. So Castro had nuclear weapons, even though there was a blockade on. They got there before the blockade. And if we had attacked, he had recommended to Khrushchev that he launch against us. So if we had followed what the Pentagon wanted and what LeMay wanted and done a bombing attack on the Soviet Union, they would have ordered a nuclear strike, which we would then have responded with a nuclear strike against Cuba and Russia, and we would have devastated both countries. Not utterly destroyed, but more damage than any other war previously. And because we didn't know that, we could have made the wrong decision. And we didn't actually know that for about 30 years. It wasn't until the 1990s that came out. Very scary, actually. Khrushchev and Kennedy both realized how dangerous that moment was. And that although of the three major actors, Khrushchev, Kennedy, and Castro, nobody really wanted war, that they had set themselves up where they might actually get it. And so they took a couple of steps to kind of ease the risk of nuclear confrontation after that. Number one, something that Kennedy had already been pushing for, and you saw that in his speech, they passed a treaty to limit the testing of nuclear weapons. It's very hard to develop a nuclear weapon unless you test it. And so this treaty made it illegal to test nuclear weapons in the air, in the atmosphere, and in the sea. You could still test them underground, though. And so some testing went on. But this was supposed to kind of slow down the arms race a little bit. And they also established the hotline between a direct line of communication between the Soviet leader and the American president, so that they wouldn't have to talk through, well, I'll have your people talk to my people in the State Department and everything, and just to kind of cool the tensions off, a direct line, which they did not have. We're at 15 minutes. We're going to keep going because, you know what, it's almost June. Here's the third world in the Cold War. What is the third world? Well, the third world is basically all those countries in green. It is Central and South America, Africa, and most of Asia, although China is sometimes considered third world, or was, and sometimes isn't. It is basically all the countries that are not first or second world. First world were the countries of Western Europe and the United States, Canada, Australia, and South Africa that supported capitalism and democracy, mostly democracy. And second world were the countries of communist philosophy, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China. And then you can see Cuba becomes part of the second world. So the two sides, the capitalist side and the communist side, battled for support in the third world. In fact, much of the Cold War, while I talked about its focus in Europe under Truman, and we'll talk about that again at the end of this slideshow, much of the Cold War is fought in the third world. Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Guatemala, as you see, and this kind of battle for support. Kennedy has two things he wants to do to try and pull the third world nations to the capitalist side. And his first is the Alliance for Progress. The Alliance for Progress is basically like a Marshall Plan for the third world. Those countries are poor, and so if they were to see some development, to develop economically, they might stay on the capitalist side instead of going communist. So the goal of that is to provide economic aid to third world nations in order to get their support for the American side in the Cold War. The problem with that, of course, is that while we put a little bit of money into the Alliance for Progress, we didn't put anywhere near the billions that we were willing to put into Europe's rebuilding in Japan with the Marshall Plan. And so that's one problem. We didn't put enough money in. And two, we're also overthrowing dictators, or overthrowing democracies and installing dictators there. We're kind of helping with the exploitation of the third world as well, for example, in Guatemala. So we're not really doing what we say. We don't really support democracy in the third world. We just support anti-communism. So the Alliance for Progress doesn't actually make much progress because the third world countries don't really believe that we mean what we say, that we want to build democracy in their economies when we're just letting our corporations grow food there and exploit their workers or take their minerals and things like that. Worldwide, he starts the Peace Corps, a group of volunteers to go serve overseas to help nations develop. And that's actually, been a wonderful program. It still exists. There are a number of Bethlehem students who've gone off to the Peace Corps, and I think it's a good program that he initiated. It's a little bit like VISTA, or AmeriCorps now in America. But it doesn't actually really do anything substantial like the Marshall Plan did to change the world. So to summarize, we have the success in the Cold War in Europe and Japan after World War II because of the Marshall Plan and rebuilding, but very limited success in the third world. We were more concerned with anti-communism than we were with really building democracies and economic development. So we often ended up supporting dictators if they were anti-communist, even if they were nasty to their people. And just to wrap it up, I'm not going to talk much about this. Many of you got it wrong on the test, but in 1948 and 49, Berlin, we know where that sits inside Eastern Germany, has the blockade, and Truman responds with the airlift. In 1961, for reasons we already talked about, the East Germans build a wall between West and East Berlin to prevent people from fleeing East Germany and East Berlin. In 1963, Kennedy goes there, and in his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, I am a Berliner. And he says things like, if people think that the Soviets are about freedom and democracy and are lifting people up, then let them come to Berlin and see what it's really like, where they build a wall. If they think that the Soviets are somebody that you can work with, let them come to Berlin. And it's a very fiery, aggressive, we will stand up to the Soviet speech, and it kind of uh, goes back to the title of this slideshow, which is Cold Warrior, that Kennedy is going to be aggressive in standing up to the Soviets. That, of course, is going to lead us to Vietnam and a problem there. All right, that's the end. I'll see you in class tomorrow.